One of the things that sort of started setting the stage for the New Deal was the decade before, the period before the New Deal, and the New Deal years, and the period before the Great Depression that led to the New Deal years. And that was there were a lot of things that were going on, prior to the New Deal. The agriculture depression during the 1920s caused a lot of hardship among farmers and among others, especially small farmers. So you started to see things starting to happen that would lead to hardship among people in the United States. In addition, we started having some of the progressive influences. We did see progressive influences in the early decades of the 20th century. So you had things going on like fighting against unscrupulous business practices, fighting for women's rights, fighting for prohibition, which of course was not successful, ended up not being successful in the long run. But women got the right to vote in 1920 through the 19th Amendment. And so you started to see all of these sort of influences coming together and bubbling up to the surface. And so I think there was a lot going on in the early years of the 20th century. From a lot of different influences were taking place that perhaps started to have influence what was going to happen in the New Deal and during the Great Depression years. What happened then was in 1929, of course, in October of 1929, October 24th, we had Black Friday and we had the stock market collapse. In the 3 years between 1929 and the time when Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, the country basically slid into the Great Depression. And so by the time Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in March of 1933, because inaugurations were still in March at that point and not in January, as they are now, the country was in pretty dire straits. I mean, we've been through that recently. We know what it's like to slide into a recession. But I think some of the statistics that we talk about for the Great Depression perhaps would resonate with people who have been through the Great Recession, our recent Great Recession. And that is that unemployment between 1929 and 1933 went from 3% to 25%. And it was probably close to 50% of people who were especially young men who were of high school, college age, or 18 to 25-year-olds, that age range. So you have a 3% to a 25% skyrocket in unemployment kind of across the board. You have average family incomes falling by about a third in that 3-year period. So you start to see this collapse happening. Industrial production fell by about a half. Housing starts fell by 4/5. Stock prices fell by 9/10, and 11,000 banks failed, taking the savings of 10 million people with them, and no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, no FIDC, no support system. When the banks failed, the savings were lost, and so that was sort of the catastrophic situation that set the basis for the Great Depression, and for Roosevelt's President Franklin Roosevelt's coming in, and why his message during his campaign of a New Deal for the American people began to resonate, because people were afraid. I mean, I think fear took hold, and fear would take hold. It was very difficult for people. And then you would hear, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and that sort of thing, which was a very powerful message because there was a lot of fear. And when we did interviews with several of us who had gone into the Civilian Conservation Corps, and when we asked them what the early years of the Great Depression were like, they would say, our parents were afraid all the time. They had no food. Our parents couldn't feed our families. We didn't know what we were going to do. We were abandoned on the streets, because our father would leave home, a mother would find work someplace else. Grandparents and other relatives would take the children they could. It was usually the teenage boys who were left to fend for themselves. So there were, the memories were, and this was in Minnesota, so the memories were pretty profound about the kinds of things that were going on. I think that puts a face to some of these statistics. People would talk on the Iron Range about 90%, unemployment reaching 80 or 90%. It was definitely a really, really very hard, when people say hard times, we think, yes, hard times. I think you have to think very hard about what they meant when they said hard times.
Wow.
was a lot of concern. There was a lot of fear still going on at that point. So there was a lot of concern about just people's livelihoods and being able to support oneself and one's family. So yeah, it was a tumultuous time. There was concern that the politics would boil over, I think, a lot of the time, and that people would be so angry at what was going on that there could be, people credit Roosevelt with providing a certain amount of stability. And as they said, as historians will sometimes say, Roosevelt, people didn't always like his policies, but they liked him. And so you see this division where you see the Supreme Court saying, no, we're not going to give you everything we want, or the Congress saying the CCC was slated to become a permanent part of government, and Congress saying, Mr. President, you can't have everything you want. We'll fund it year by year until we see what's going to happen to it, or the WPA, you can't always have everything you want. And I don't know that was slated to become permanent, but Mr. President, I know you want to support these things, but Congress, we're going to put the brakes on you a little bit. But at the same time, so people didn't always like the policies, but they liked the man. I think there was a lot of, generally, a sense that Franklin Roosevelt himself, was a strong enough leader to pull people through some of the fear and some of the anger and some of the rioting and some of the other things that was going on with programs that were cut. And so, because there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of concern. There were the farmers coming in and the farmers' strikes and that sort of thing. Lobbying, having had a decade before of problems. There ended up doing quite a few programs. There was one of the things that happened that was kind of interesting, I think, is that we had in the United States at that point, we had what we called relief. And that, people think about welfare now, there's a great difference between the two. But the relief programs in the United States at that time were traditionally, and they had been for a long, long time, they had been throughout the history of the United States, relief programs were local. And they were primarily one-stop shop help things. And so people would go if you did run into trouble, if a family of the provider got sick, went to the hospital, couldn't, you go to your local county or township board or group, your relief, and ask for help. And someone would bring you a bag of groceries, someone would buy you a tank of gas, someone would pay your rent for the month, that sort of thing. And so that was a very local kind of a self-help sort of thing. And of course, as the country started to slide into the Great Depression, the relief was just overwhelmed. So you start to see the governments stepping in through the Federal Emergency Relief Act and then the state doing the same thing, trying to sort of coordinate all of this. And among other things, there was money given out. That was the dole. That was not popular. No one wanted to be on the dole, as they said. You see work farms and all sorts of things happening through relief. That was how we handled things. But then what happened was that Franklin Roosevelt said, starting as first days he became president, was that he wanted to do what he called work relief, where if people who were eligible for relief could be provided work through some of the federal programs, and the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, was a very well-known work relief program for 18 to 25-year-old young men. And so they were trying then to do things that would provide people, use the talents and the abilities of people who needed work, provide them with work, but they also had to be eligible for relief. So they had to be poor enough to be able to really accept this. In 1933, there was also something called the Civil Works Administration, which was a little bit of a forerunner of the WPA. And this gave money to states. They did build roads and schools and things like that, and it became a model for what later became the Works Projects Administration, or the Works Progress Administration. It actually had two names. And so it lasted from 1933 to 1934, this early program did, but it started to then set the stage for what became the WPA, which was the largest of the programs providing work for people who were eligible for relief. It was also called a recovery program. In the United States history, the WPA was the granddaddy of them all, providing work for people and on public projects, a real variety of types of public projects. The WPA began in 1935, and it was defunded it ended in 1942, and I believe its funding ran out in 1943. So it lasted into World War II, when the need for these programs was not as great anymore. There was a lot of, in fact, it wasn't as great at all. And a lot of the programs that had been sort of signature New Deal programs, ended. The CCC ended, the NYA, the National Youth Association, NYA ended, and the WPA all ended during that time because there wasn't the need for them anymore. But the WPA was the granddaddy of them all. It employed 8.5 million people between 1935 and 1942. It constructed 650,000 miles of roads across the country. It did 125,000, the WPA workers built 125,000 public buildings, and you see them around with the little Art Deco shapes. You see a county building or a township building or a city hall in a little town or something like this. Great buildings. Schools. I gave a talk once and a woman raised her hand and said, I went to a WPA-built school. That was my grade school here in Minneapolis. So they're all over. I mean, the mark of people is there. 75,000 bridges nationally, 8,000 parks they worked in, including a lot of Minnesota's state parks, and 800 airports. So there was a real variety of types of work, a lot of roads, a lot of sidewalks in towns, work on infrastructure basically for communities was the work that the WPA did. WPA workers were paid about $40 a month, which would translate to, $500-600, I think, a month in today's wages, at least, if you look at the rate of inflation. So this was not a small amount. It made a difference in families' lives, and men and women could be employed in the WPA. So we really did see people, we really did see it meeting a need by providing employment for people and building infrastructure throughout the country and in Minnesota as well. At its peak, it says, I have a couple different, 3.5 million, 5 million, 8.5 million people employed. At its peak, 3.5 million people at a time employed by the WPA. The appropriations for the program amounted to about $11 billion total for the WPA. So you do see a lot of money being pumped back in, $40 a month at a time, basically, or whatever it was. And plus and then of course I think, if it worked like the CCC, and you'd have to check this out, sometimes the supplies would have to be provided by the community, and then the labor was provided by the WPA. So you see a lot of kind of working together to make sure that that the communities were also felt that they were a part of the program, and that they sort of bought into the whole thing too, to make sure that they were okay. The WPA also ran the Federal Arts Project, the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Writers Project. So there were some really interesting arts projects that came out. And in Minnesota, of course, we have the WPA, the books on WPA, Minnesota during the WPA, the travel guides that came out for every state. And there's one for Minnesota and there's one for northeastern Minnesota that really do describe what was, what to visit in Minnesota and what was there, and give us a real good snapshot. The WPA guidebooks were a little bit political, and they actually came under fire from the Representative Martin Dees from Texas, a Democrat from Texas, and who formed the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was concerned because so many voices were coming out, and there were what they call the slave narratives were part of this, where there were interviews which have a lot of controversy attached to them now, but there were interviews with former slaves who were still alive in the 1930s, who were talking about what it was like to make that transition. this stuff is all at the Library of Congress. So you see all sorts of things happening during those Great Depression years with the WPA program. It just goes in a lot of different directions. They felt that there was a real need to employ, and I think the people actually lobbied for this. You know, artists were unemployed, theater people, musicians were unemployed, and they really did work hard and lobby for this work that, you know, to provide work for themselves. And so you see that. You don't see things compartmentalized with this sort of thing, I think, which was very interesting, because when you talk about the WPA, you think about a highway or something like that, or a street or a sidewalk or a building. And I think they were much broader than that. They were really looking at ways of making sure that people were employed, and then money was being pumped back into the economy, which was what was needed. Which is why it's sometimes called a recovery program, because they were encouraging people, they were paying people who then would go out and spend the money and start to stabilize things, they hoped, a little bit anyway. There was application. I know I've read a little bit about the Federal Writers Project, and it was a little bit political in that situation. I expect it would be with the others as well. There would be a state director. There was a state director, and I don't know the name in Minnesota. I know the director of the relief program, but not the Writers. I can't remember the name of the Writers Project director. But there was a state director who would oversee, you know, the work that was being done. And then with the Writers Project, there was a lot of effort made to actually go out and talk to people on the ground and to learn, not just to do the research in the libraries, but it was the start of kind of some of the federal programs that we have at the Library of Congress now, and where there were interviews made like this, where people would go in and say, tell us what's going on in your community. And then that information was used to help write the WPA guidebooks. It's a fascinating time because there was a lot of interest. There was a beginning interest in sort of bringing people's voices into the narrative of the history. And so you start to see all sorts of things expanding that's going on around the country in all sorts of different ways. And you start to see recreation wound into it. You start to see all sorts of things happening. And recreation through an understanding of, if you have a WPA guidebook, the guidebooks were designed to help people explore, use their free time, learn about their own states. And so that was part of all of this. So you see a lot of kinds of things going on during that period. There was, as the 20th century started to come along, there was people's changes in leisure habits began to take place. So there were, supposedly, and we all have to look at this within context and as we think back on it, lives became perhaps a little easier. There was more free time. There was more leisure time for people, and so there was time for people to start exploring recreational activities like golfing and golf courses. And so you start to see the change in people's leisure or recreational patterns, I think, during that time as well. And that leads to a lot of changes that came later. In the WPA, people who were eligible for relief and who needed the work, and you would go in and apply. And I think there was there were local offices to go where you would go in and apply, and then there was a state relief office run by a guy named Fred Rarig, R-A-R-I-G, who would oversee a lot of what was going on and making sure that things were running smoothly in the state. So there was some coordination. It wasn't the formal, informal relief program. There was a much more formal structure that was put in place under Floyd B. Olson and his successors. The CCC was a program for 18 to 25-year-old young men, and it was a work relief program. It was the first one. And so Franklin Roosevelt actually set it up started setting it up on Inauguration Day. He asked for the plan for it on Inauguration Day, and 3 weeks later the Congress passed it. past that, and by a month, a week after that, the first camps were being set up. So it was a program that got its start very, very quickly. It was designed to help alleviate some of the worst of the unemployment among the 18 to 25-year-olds, because unemployment was so high. And it was always considered kind of his pet program. It was one of the programs he felt strongly about. He tried it as a governor in New York. He'd tried a little bit of it out. He'd done a little bit of that. He had a program in New York State that, when he was governor, that was similar. And so there's always a lot of discussion about the fact that the CCC was well liked. Generally, it was considered a pretty popular and well-respected program. It was run by a man who was an AFL from the American Federation of Labor. So it had its roots in labor too, in the AFL side of labor. I think the WPA, if you start to think about the reputations that they had, the WPA, there was, you still talk to people and they will say, at least my age, I know growing up, the generation after this, people would say, well, the WPA, and then they kind of look, a little bit, roll their eyes a little and say, well, they all stood around on their shovels and got paid. And they didn't. I mean, they worked very, very hard, and there was a tremendous amount of work that was done. But the CCC didn't have that reputation for whatever reason. It continues to be a program that people have kind of a strong sense of positive feeling. There were WPA camps, and they're sometimes confused with CCC camps. CCC camps were really, except for the two camps, one at Lake Vadnais and one in over by the Parkway in Minneapolis. There's one in St. Paul and one in Minneapolis. Otherwise, the CCC camps were pretty much out at the work sites, and the work sites were conservation areas throughout the country and the state. So you have camps at state parks, you have camps in state forests, camps in national forests. Those are the CCC camps. They were run by the Army. They were pretty much a spit and polish kind of camp. They look like little Army camps, and people remembered, the inspections and that sort of thing. The WPA also ran a series of camps, a much smaller number. I think there was one at Mendota Heights. There may have been one down in Bloomington. That some of these are still well known, where they were called transient camps. They were places where people who were transient workers who had no place else to go could go and work in projects. And so there were a number of transient camps around Minnesota that actually did some of the work for the WPA. In some cases, they worked with the CCC. I don't think the two camps I mentioned did, but up at Itasca State Park and some of the other state parks, you will see WPA camps and CCC working together. And in some state parks, you just have, I think Lake Chetek might have been one of them, you just have WPA people, you just have a WPA work. Again, that recreational, the work of the WPA and working on recreational projects. And so there were a few. You can usually tell if you read photographs and you want to look at a photograph and you go to the photographs, collections of historic photographs for Minnesota, for example, and you look at a picture of a camp. The WPA camps are usually kind of relaxed looking, and then clotheslines are full of socks hanging over, and the CCC camps are all spit and polish and painted rocks and flagpoles and things. So you kind of get a sense for looking at them and being able to understand what was what, and then get a sense for what was going on in these camps. I mean, the transient camps were very different things than the CCC camps, but both served Minnesota well. They were local projects, and so you'd have people working in your community. You did not. The CCC would send people up and down, from state to state. Sometimes you'd be moved around to where the work was. I think the WPA was very much a local project, local work. So you'd hire people locally, and they'd go home at night. I mean, that was the job. That was the 8 hours of work during the day and back home at night. So that was my understanding. Is that's how most of the WPA work was done. I've looked at books where there's been, there's some books with photographs of the work that was done in Minnesota, the WPA, and they really focus a lot on the buildings. I mean, there's just page after page after page of the buildings that, that were built, which is great because that's something that's so visible and it's something that's so tied with the WPA. But the golf courses are an interesting part of WPA history, and I expect it's little known. And I think it's fascinating. But the fact that they were able to take this and look at it maybe as a community improvement project, the way you look at a street or a sidewalk or a building, and say our community, we're progressive. We help, we work with our citizens. We provide people recreational opportunities. We're keeping up. This is one thing we can do. We can build ourselves a golf course and make it available to people. And they did. And they did across the state. They're not known for their golf courses, are they? But I would think that they were providing work for people, and they had workers, and they needed work. I was surprised to learn that they did airports, too, to be honest with you, anything like that. This was something that served the community. There was an interest in recreation and in growth of recreation, and it was something that the communities could benefit from. And so they were looking at, why did they do parks? They were looking at ways that they could benefit. And I would think that it was a growing trend in the country. Golf was something that was becoming more and more popular. People were becoming interested in it. Towns wanted golf courses. They felt that this was a community improvement and that the WPA was there to help. And so I suppose the projects were developed and off they went. Franklin Roosevelt was a very pragmatic president, as I understand, and in looking at the history. He sensed that the United States was going to need to be more prepared than perhaps they could be. So some of these programs, people have said the same thing about the CCC. The Army was involved with the CCC. The Army Reserve officers got an awful lot of experience in troop movement by moving companies of CCC enrollees around, running camps, doing all of that. And there's always been this question about that sort of underlies that no one's, you just every once in a while bubbles to the surface like this. Well, what happened then? The enrollees learned to live in an armed forces environment. All these young men, and they became fit, whereas before they had been, they hadn't gotten enough to eat, they were weak, they went in, they became, one of the statistics with the CCC is that they grew 3 inches and gained 10 pounds, most of them, at least. So, and then when they went into the armed forces, if you were a CCC enrollee, you were always bumped up a little bit. Oh, you're an enrollee. Okay, we need you. You know the ropes. You know how to run this. And so and then the people who had been the directors of the camps, the lieutenants and the colonels, had experience. So you see all of that going on. You do see that. The same thing with the WPA. You see this infrastructure. You see people beginning to work. You see people beginning to think about these. Beginning to be taught these things, even at a time when they were resisting knowing that they needed it through the country's emphasis on taking care of itself during the Great Depression and listening to isolationist forces that would have prevented anything else happening. So I think there's a real pragmatic side to all of this. It's really interesting that isn't as well documented. It's very subtle, but I think it's there. People were ashamed to be on what they called the dole, and that was relief. That was taking money for not working. That was just a handout. People really didn't like it. I mean, it was relief. You had to go to your neighbors and say, I can't make it. Maybe they're your neighbors across the street, or maybe maybe somebody you see in church or in whatever you're doing, and say, I can't make it, I've got to have help. That's a difficult thing to do, and then accept the help. And people were ashamed. People would end up on work farms, which we don't have anymore, because that was one way to provide work for people who were on the dole or who were on relief. And so there was that kind of thing going on. There was something to it. when we talk to in CCC enrollees, and I think it would be the same for the WPA, they were proud of the fact that they were working for their money. And that became something that was a factor. That's why when we talk about the programs, we say work relief, because they were working, and that was an important factor for these programs. People were being given work to do, and when they thought about it later, they were proud of the work they did. We should look around pretty carefully at what was at our communities, because I think I think people would be amazed at the amount of work or the impact that the WPA had on what our communities are like, or what they look like, or what some of the infrastructure is. A surprise. I mean, it's sometimes a surprise to people to think about all the work that the WPA did, but it was definitely a major, had an impact on Minnesota and on the work and the state and what was done here.